Hi guys! In this video, we'll focus building our details page. We'll also add properties from our OData service to our details header and attach product listing table to our content. By the way, if you are new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. Also, make sure to stick around to the end because I'll share with you 3 binding syntax in SAPUI5. Alright, without further ado, let's jump into it. In our previous video, we talked about routing and navigation. So we've discussed routes and route patterns, and we also discussed targets. So it's basically navigating from our home page to our details page. We also tackle navigation with parameters, passing data from one page to another. So right now our details page is empty, but we are able to pass the sales order ID from the orders table to this page. Our goal here is to display the following details in our details page. So we have our sales order ID, then we also have our customer name, and we also have the gross amount and the currency code. We also have the life cycle description and also customize the color based on the state. And then we also have our creation date, and we also have some notes if there's a note on the sales order item. And below that, details in our header, we also have the product listing, which contains our product ID and our quantity or product quantity. But before diving into details, let's discuss what is element binding. So element binding is also known as context binding. It allows you to bind an element to one specific object or data object. So what does it mean? For example, we have a JSON object person with first name, last name, age, and several hobbies to include. If we are to display the first name property in our single text field, then we have to do is bind that property and access the property binding using the person slash first name. And if we want to bind the remaining properties in our JSON object, we need to modify that binding and access the direct path for each property. So it's quite tedious because you need to type the person slash first name, then for another field you have to type person slash last name. Now the problem in here is that as this object grow or gets bigger, or if our UI becomes more complex or complicated, the binding path becomes hard to work with. Imagine if you have a full edit profile with several fields and adding binding to each those fields. So that's quite a task for you to do because you need to update each binding and each property every time you change the JSON object. So this is where element binding becomes handy because element binding creates a reference or a pointer for us. This reference is what we refer to as a binding context. So for example, you have your element and you want to access the data from the data object. You can use the binding as the connection between the UI and the data object and access information on the data object using your binding context. So going back to our sample, instead of accessing the property directly using the person slash first name or person slash whatever property we want, so instead we bind the whole container or the VBox and point it to the person object, and then inside, the controls inside will now be pointing relatively to the properties of the person object because we use element binding as a pointer and a reference. As you can see in here, our text doesn't contain the person slash in the first name, but instead it now points relatively to the person object. This makes it easier for us to modify the binding without messing with the properties itself. So for example, next time you want to change the object you're pointing into, but with the same amount of properties, you don't need to rebuild all of the binding path that you have created. So now how can we apply this to our details page? So on our details controller, that's JS, so we already have our sales order ID based from the route parameter, or we get the parameters from our URL. So we have this SID right here. Next is to actually use that ID to find the path to the sales order item that we want to display. So if we go back to our ES5, so for example, we have our first sales order item. The path to that item is actually sales order set with the sales order ID inside the URL parameter. So to access that sales order item, we need to provide the sales order ID and the sales order set in this syntax. So you have your sales order ID set, and then you have your sales order ID inside the parentheses. So this is our path to the current sales order item that we want to display. So if you place this in your URL, you will get the sales order details for this item. For example, you have the gross amount, our net amount, and our tax amount. And then the next step is, after getting the specific sales order item, is to create an element binding in our page and display that data in our UI. So let's edit our details controller, and in here we can actually create a new variable called sPath. So this will be the path to the specific sales order item. Then we get the current view and get the current model, which points to our ES5 OData service. And then there's a method or function called createKey. So the first parameter is to provide the sales order set. And then the second parameter is actually an object which should provide the keys to that entity. So it accepts sales order ID and use the SID that we got from the route parameter. Okay. So we can remove the alert. And then just console log this path in our browser. So you can save this one and rerun our application. If you open up your console, you can actually see that it generated the same path that we want from the ES5 OData service. So now we can use this path to get the specific sales order item and bind the page to this order item or entity. So you might say, why can we just concatenate the sales order ID, and why do the hassle of using the createKey function just to generate this path? This is because the createKey function formats our binding path for us based on the metadata or the definition on the ES5 OData service. So this is a good practice to validate if our key or property keys are actually matched to your OData service. So this prevents malformed paths and non-existing paths because it's already validated against the metadata. Alright, next is to create an element binding to our page, since we want the whole page to point to the specific sales order item. So to do that, in our onRoute match, is we want to get the current view and then bind element. So this is the syntax for element binding, and then /path because we are pointing to the root, and then add the sPath that we just generated from the function createKey. Then hit save and then refresh your browser. So what we did here is basically telling SAPUI5 that we want the current view to point to the specific sales order item, or which is the sPath that we have created, and element bind the whole page. So anything property that we want to access, we can now access it relatively, and UI5 will automatically match the exact property in our ES5 or sales order item. Now, to check if we have successfully bound the current view to our sales order item, you can actually go to your developer tools and open the SAPUI5 inspector. So make sure you have installed this in your browser, And then if you click the SAPUI5 inspector, you can actually find the current view. And then in your left pane, you have your bindings. So the second tab, go to the tab and then click the path, and you will see that we have the data for that specific sales order item in here, and we can actually access these properties in our current view, since the full page or the whole view now points to this sales order item. So next is to actually attach this data to our details view. So let's create our details header. So inside your details view, inside the content tag, just copy paste the source code from the description box below, and don't forget to beautify your source code. So what we did here is we actually just added the title and pointed to the sales order ID, the intro to the customer name, and then we use the number, again similar to our homepage. We pointed to the gross amount and the currency code using the OData formatter currency. And then we also have our object status with life cycle description, and then the state, which uses our formatter. So don't worry, we'll fix that later on by importing the dependency and the formatter object. And then we also have our creation date here using the standard OData date formatter. And then last is our note if the order item contains a details note in the property or the entity property. So save this one and go to your details controller, because we need to import the formatter. So copy paste the formatter class, and then don't forget to import this as a dependency parameter, and then create a local property and assign the formatter instance to that property, so that when you trigger the formatter.format status, it will execute the formatter function. Okay, so save and rerun. Alright, now our details page is almost complete because we have the sales order ID, which is what we assigned in the title, and then the intro as the customer name, cross amount with currency code as well, and the formatting as the currency. Also have the creation date and the notes from our ES5 entity, and then as well as the formatting or the colorized state based on our formatter function. So the next step is to add our product list table, and to do that, if we go back to our ES5 OData entity, there's actually a navigation property that we can use to display those product items, which is the to-line items. So go back to your details view.xml, and then let's create a standard list. And then let's point the items to the two-line items in our ES5. Notice that we don't have the slash here because it's a navigation property, but it's also an aggregation, so it will just display the two-line items or the product listing. And then let's just add the header text just to label the list with products, and then give the list a template. So I'll just use the display list item control and assign the label to the product ID and the value to the quantity. Okay, save. Also don't forget to beautify and save and refresh. So now as you can see, we have our quantity, but my product ID doesn't display. I think there's a to correct the product ID property. Then refresh. So we have the products ID, sorry for the typo, and then we have the product quantity as well. So it looks like our details page is now complete. So it's now time to discuss with you the three binding syntax in SAPUI5. So the first is the simple binding. This is the one that we are very familiar with. So you just specify the path to your data. So for example, you have your first name, And you can also add some formatters as well. This is also considered as simple data binding because you just specifically provided the path to the data. Next is your composite binding, which instead of giving one data source, you provided several data sources or sources for the data object. For example, you have your gross amount in here and the currency code. So this is considered as composite binding. And last is your expression binding, which is like your formatter, but instead of doing it separately on a file or a function, you just inline the expression in your binding. So you have your quantity here with the simple logic, tertiary logic of your error and success. Alright, our application is almost done. We can actually say that at this point, we have our homepage fully functional with its filterable and sorting and etc. And then we also have our details page displaying our sales order item level details as well as the product listing. So in our next video, we'll add some few aesthetics enhancements like responsive controls just to make our app look good across different devices and sizes or device screen sizes. And we also clean up some hard-coded files like text in our actual views. And finally, I'll show you how to deploy this in our SAP cloud platform, Fiori Launchpad, and some screenshot on how to deploy this on your ABAP or gateway system. Also, don't forget to drop a comment below if you have any question. Also, subscribe and hit that notification bell or leave a like if you like this video. And that's all for this video, and I will see you in the next one.